回到新闻现场，带您关心到美国联准会在今年已经2度降息了。虽然目前因为政府关门进入到经济数据的空窗期，但是市场大多认为降息的节奏跟方向不会有太大的改变，继续为年底行情助攻。不过，乐观降息的预期也将拉高利率波动，这让市场的风险偏好逐渐扩散到非投资等级债等固定收益资产。长期而言，能够提供类似于股市的报酬机会，但是波动性却降低许多。要如何挑选产业别，并展望2026的机会点？请看我们的关键对话。
关键时刻掌握关键对话。大家好，我是思翰。时间过得很快哦，马上就来到2025年的尾声了。回顾这一整年呢，全球的股市可以说是经过了大落之后又大起。好多地方的股市都在续创新高当中啊，而这背后的原因包括 AI 所驱动的科技财报，还有联准会进入了降息循环，甚至是美国总统川普他的政策不确定性利空还在逐渐钝化当中。所以说，展望2026年，川普总统他的政策究竟会如何持续的影响美国的股市、汇市，甚至是债券市场的投资呢？我们这回很荣幸的是邀请到了富兰克林坦伯顿公司债基金经理人葛伦华勒，一起来聊聊他的看法。Hello, Glenn. Nice to meet you. Would you like to say hello to our audience?
Hello. Thank you for watching.
Okay, so first of all, we want to talk about 2025. It's actually quite a pretty strong year for the U.S. economy. So looking ahead to 2026 with President Trump in the office, what's your read on the U.S. economy, dollar, and also how do you think the Fed's policy will evolve?
Yes, so overall we're constructive on the U.S. economy, but we acknowledge that some of the policy uncertainty, policy volatility, if you will, causes some concern among corporations and investors alike. We think this policy uncertainty is leading to growth slowing in the second half of 2025 from the levels we experienced in the first half, but we think growth will still remain positive, and we're not worried that it's heading into a recession. And keep in mind that many of the pro-growth aspects of the Big Beautiful Bill start to kick in 2026. So, increased tax deductions, no taxes on tips for certain workers. So we think growth should reaccelerate next year. And we hope to have more policy certainty or visibility next year as well. But we think the Fed as a whole is a very strong institution. And we think one single member cannot have undue influence over the voting decisions of a 12-member voting committee. In addition, we think the Fed takes its job very seriously. And the ghost of Arthur C. Burns, who was the Fed chair in the 1970s, hangs over the head of the Fed. And no one wants to be responsible for another runaway bout of inflation like that.
If political pressure pushes for a quicker rate cut, what impact would it have on the corporate bonds, especially the high-yield one?
More rapid Fed cuts than we expect, it would have two different effects. Near term, I think it would be positive. It would add fuel to the economy. Particularly lower rates would enable both companies and individuals to refinance debt at lower costs, and thus freeing up cash flow for other uses. So near term, it could be a positive, but longer term, we think if the Fed cuts too much or too fast, it could reinflate inflation. And inflation hasn't gone away yet. It's still running ahead of the Fed's target. So we think the Fed will be very careful about this. But if they were to cut too much, it risks reinflating inflation, which could then drive up longer-term yields, which could have an adverse impact on the economy.
So they still have to concern about inflation, right?
Yes, the inflation concerns have not gone away.
Mm-hmm. So which U.S. high-yield sector do you think will benefit the most from the President Trump's policy, and which sectors will be maybe at risk?
Yeah, if you just sum up Trump's policies in one phrase, it's America first. So we think those sectors that are focused on the U.S., domestic manufacturing, domestic energy production, the infrastructure that goes around, both energy and highways and the like, will benefit. We think the industries most at risk are twofold. We think retail is at risk from ongoing tariff announcements. And then we think the healthcare industry, and in particular pharmaceuticals, is in Trump's crosshairs. He's not happy with current high drug prices. I think it's mixed for the tech industry because they have a lot of exports to China. And some of those, especially advanced technologies, are at risk. So I think there will be some positives, but there's some risks as well that need to be navigated.
So at this timing, because now it's still like a bull market for the stock market actually. So do you think it's a good timing for investing like a bond market?
I do. I think in particular high yield offers compelling returns. The yield on the high yield index is about 6.75%. You're getting that yield with a much lower duration than other fixed income sectors. So if inflation increases and rates move higher again, you're not as exposed to that risk in high yield. Especially US stocks are very tech focused, and really 5 to 7 tech stocks are driving everything. In high yield, you get these 6.75% yield, which I would argue is equity-like returns, but with a much more diversified mix of exposure to the economy, and also with a lot less volatility and downside risk.
Okay, so when it comes to picking bonds, what are the top few things that you look at?
Yes, the main thing we focus on is cash flow generation. Not only current cash flow generation, but the sustainability of that. And then we like to assess downside risks as well. So we look at the capital structure, not only the sustainability, but where are our bonds in that capital structure? How much debt is subordinated to us? What assets are below us? If we're wrong about our investment idea, what's the recovery value like to be? So we're always looking at the downside cases to make sure the risk reward makes sense.
So for Taiwanese investors, because a lot of them are drawn to high yield opportunity, of course. So could you walk us through the key feature and advantage of your high yield strategies?
Yeah, I think the key feature is that we're rigorous fundamental investors. We employ a large and experienced team of analysts to look at the entire high yield universe. We will look out 3 to 5 years when we make an investment. It doesn't mean we need to hold the investment that long, but we're willing to. And this means we can be contrarian and buy industries when they're out of favor, and we think offering us extra risk or extra yield, that is, for the risk we're taking. We've been gradually de-risking the portfolio this year. So we're still very favorable on the outlook for high yield, but as spreads have come in tighter, you're getting paid less to take risk. So we think the proper response then is to take less risk. So we've been high grading the portfolio. We've moved to an underweight in triple Cs. Within sectors, we favor avoiding industries that are in secular decline, melting ice cubes, if you will. These are things like retail, where brick and mortar or mall-based retailers are being hurt by e-commerce. We are also underweight sectors where there's increased competition resulting from changes in technology. We think we're very good at what we do, but we don't have a crystal ball. We can't see the future. So we would rather avoid having to take those risks.
Okay, my last question. Even though the government policy are become clear, but there is still a lot of uncertainty. As we read up 2025, do you have any recommendation for the investors? And also, what should they prepare for 2026?
Yes, I think we're in an environment where the U.S. has a president who likes to negotiate, and this will lead to ongoing volatility. And I think investors need to be prepared for that. But as we've seen, he's very focused on the economy and the markets. And after the Liberation Day tariffs, for instance, when the market reacted negatively, he backed off. So we think ultimately the economy should continue to grow, and this should be a favorable environment for high yield. But I would caution that volatility will remain elevated, so I think a longer-term investment horizon is very important. In high yield, you are paid to invest now. So the benefit of waiting, is not obvious to me. So I would advocating, investing now, starting to earn that income at this moment when, we think the fundamental picture is positive, we think defaults will remain low, and we think the yield is attractive.
Wow, thank you, Glenn. That's a really nice interview, and thanks for your time. 错过了2025年的大行情，千万不要忘记了，还有2026紧跟在后哦。不过在股市高档震荡之际，或许更多元、更灵活的投资，在不论是基金或是债券，都是一个聪明的理财方式哦。提供给您。以上就是今天的关键对话，我是思翰，我们下次见。
财经新闻不漏接，赶快下载非凡新闻 APP。